Sandoval,
And I'm Lamont Williams,
and we are playing
playing
Dread.
Dread.
I was not expecting that.
I was trying to time it. I was waiting for it.
Oh, that's the kind of thing we would have to do if we were recording in person together. There's always going to be a delay on the internet. Um, anyway, uh, and we're leaving all that in, by the way. We're not taking a second take. That's just what's going into the podcast. This week on Playing Dread, we're talking about Hollowbody. And, according to my notes, this game just came out in 2024. Are we allowed to do that?
I know. We're breaking some rules. We have been doing like past games for so long, so it is a unique situation for us to do something so new.
Yeah, really. I mean, and not just like, within the last couple of years, like literally within the last couple of months. This game is fairly fresh and seems to be doing okay for itself. At least that's what I've been seeing. Like I don't know that this is like as well known of a title as some of the other more recent survival horrors that we saw. I mean, I know Crow Country came out this year. I believe Signalis was either this year or the past year. I don't know that it's kind of reached those heights, but it seems to be doing pretty well for itself, which is always a good thing to see in this atmosphere. So there's going to be some changes to the format. We definitely tend to do retrospectives at the beginning of the podcast, at least before kind of diving into our thoughts and such. We typically start out by saying, what was our first experience with this game and everything. A little tough to do with a game that's only a few months old and such. What I can say is I remember Lamont, I believe you were the one who shared with me like one of the first trailers for this game. I don't even remember how long ago that was. It was definitely before the game was out. And we were both kind of waiting for this game to come out based off of that. So I'm gonna ask you, like, how did you hear about the
So
game? Do you remember?
I need to give myself a moment, but I do remember finding the Kickstarter. I think I was on Instagram and somehow, some way, this game crossed my radar. And I'm a sucker for a Kickstarter. And I don't always like put my money out to him, but at the same time, like I'll do a rabbit hole and I'll go onto Kickstarter and I'll just start finding things that are like related. And I think that's how I found this game. It was definitely, yeah, that's what it was. Instagram to Kickstarter, Kickstarter to the rabbit hole to finding Hollowbody and being like, "Oh, this looks really cool." Um, and then thinking about Adrian immediately because I was like, "Oh, this is like PS2 horror." And then the next thing that happened was that I found the YouTube, and the other thing that I'm a sucker for is dev diaries. Like I love learning about like game design and game designers and their method and like how they get to the point of like, developing the game. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of our listeners know that, both you and I have game design background as far as like education goes. And so like whenever I can see a dev diary, it just takes me to like a special place where I'm like, oh, game development.
Yeah, definitely for sure. So I think there's a couple of things that you said there that are particularly interesting to me. Number one, finding the game through a social media source. I mean, I'm not a big social media person myself, and if there is a blind spot, dating myself as a now 40-year-old, and if there's a blind spot to my current career as a video game developer, it really is that like social media element because that is essentially how all marketing for not just indie games, but really all video games is happening now. And, the other thing, Kickstarter you had mentioned is that like from using, from the social media outreach was how you found out about the Kickstarter, which is generally how, indie video game marketing works right now. Now, I'm saying this as someone who is a developer who had a successful Kickstarter for their game, and I did that. I should say we did that. The Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends team did it perfectly organically, right? We posted on Twitter about the game. We had friends who are fairly influential in the game development sphere that were able to carry the message farther than we could. And we are very lucky to have that network, right? A lot of indie developers who are first starting out, not in the case of Hollowbody and Headwear Games, and from what I can tell, Headwear Games is primarily a solo developer, Nathan Hamley. Most developers like Nathan are not lucky enough to have a network like that can spread it further than their own personal reach. So it's really cool, number one, that, this isn't Headwear Games' first game, but it's cool that they were able to do it, that it could get to someone like you, Lamont, completely disconnected from it, to get to your eyes, to lead you to the Kickstarter, to recommend it to me, because again, that's just not something that is easy in the current video game atmosphere at all. It is a little bit easier for horror games. Horror games are one of those genres that are a little bit easier to get like something of a viral following. It's just a very popular genre among the indie game space. Now, I will say from my perspective, once you showed it to me, yeah, actually, I think that this game stood out for me a lot more actually than a lot of the more recent indie horror games because it you know, the art style itself and the look of the game and the setting of the game are all very unique. So I don't wanna say that this game is too much of a clone of these other PS2 games, but it really kind of felt like it embodied that PS2 game mentality. And when I say it had that mentality of the PS2 game from the look and feel of it, it looked like a game that would play on the PlayStation 2, but it also looked like its own thing. It looked original enough that I could see this coming out on the PlayStation 2 like so many other games, not just Silent Hill and Resident Evil, but stuff like Siren and Rule of Rose and games like that, you know, it's in that wheelhouse, but it also had its own distinctive feel. Like, it felt like a game that I could really sink my teeth into. Whereas a lot of the other horror games that were coming out at the time they didn't really scratch that itch. They for all intents and purposes looked like a modern video game, or at least and that is something that they should be proud of, and I think that the reason why those games have had the level of success that they have is because they don't just look like every other video game out there. They have their own unique look and their own unique feel. Hollowbody has its own unique setting and its own unique vibe, but it still looks like something I would have played on the PlayStation 2 back then, which is not something I could say about Signalis and Crow Country. Two games that I also really like, two games that we're definitely going to cover on the podcast someday. Hollowbody really stood out as like a game that felt like it could be a PlayStation 2 game, but also wasn't specifically just Silent Hill again. It wasn't just Resident Evil again. And that stood out to me. And I think that is honestly one of the areas where like Headwear Games should be pretty proud of themselves. And I think that does actually come through when you play the game itself. So all this is just a long way of me just saying that, yeah, like, you showed the game to me, and it definitely was like, "Well, I'm definitely playing that when it comes out," and then it did come out, and, I think you and me were pretty quick on the ball to say, "Oh, this game is out now, we definitely wanna play it, and we should cover it once we do." So, it's a couple of months out, but we got there
Hey, you know
eventually.
what? It is, as we said earlier, this is a newer game for us. Like, we've been dealing with older games, so the fact that we jumped on something new this quick, that is almost revolutionary for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I mean, we have a list. We've got a docket out there of games that we want to cover, and we have a docket of different formats that we want to try instead of just doing the individual game covering that we're doing here. And, you know, that's something down the road that we'll talk about in the future and such. But I think it is definitely interesting with this one in particular that it's not just that we're covering a new game, it's that we're covering something that came out like a few months ago. That's also going to have some challenges with this podcast, but, we'll get there.
when you and I went to college, we started at a unique time, in the games field, in game development, and, like, the entire, like, spectrum of it. And one of my takeaways is that when we started then, I wish that we had such interesting, like, game development software like Unity and Unreal.
I talk about that with my students all the time. We have like so many more resources and things that, like from free game engines to YouTube tutorials, it just that just did not exist at all for us. So yeah, I totally get where you're coming from there.
So, with that said, I love kind of hearing about the development of this game and, like, kind of what Nathan went through, because this is the game that he kind of always wanted to make. He listening to other interviews and stuff with him, like, he's always been a big Silent Hill fan, and I believe this is his 3rd game, but, like, it was always building up to this. I know that you talk to your students and, like, going back to college, one of the things that we always talk about for new game designers is just being aware of scale. Because,
Absolutely,
like,
yeah.
you come in with big ideas and big dreams and none of the experience to back that up. And Nathan understood that, and I think that's important because we talked about, like, I didn't play his other games, but
Yeah, same.
those other games were building blocks. They helped him get to the point of being able to make Hollowbody and to be able to, like, do these smaller games that were, one was more of an adventure game, but doing that adventure game allowed him to use, I'm trying to remember what tool he used that was made for adventure games and dialogue and
Yeah, no, it was a adventure game studio, which I touched but have never really like gone too far down that rabbit hole with. You and me started with RPG Maker though, so we know exactly that
yes.
that
So,
process.
being able to use Adventure Game Studio and then learn from that, and, he talks about how so for Hollowbody, he was very much doing it all. He's an artist, like, first and foremost, but he was doing the art, he was doing the programming. In his last game, he had a friend step in and help him with some of the programming, but he learned from that friend in the last game, so in this one, it was all him. He did the music, he did all of that himself. But he does mention that, jumping into Unity was kind of a good experience for him because he's not a programmer, not by, necessarily a programmer, but being able to visually program was a big step, like a big, stepping stone for him.
Yeah, and I was gonna say that was one of the things that shocked me to learn. I usually tell my students that if they can help it to stay away from visual scripting because it doesn't really give you the level of control that you would need to be able to develop a game like Hollow Body. And even I'm looking at like screens of Chasing Static right now, the game that preceded Hollow Body. I'm I didn't play it either, but looking at it now, like, honestly, I'm very surprised, like, this looks like a very polished, very professional we're not done, you're not done kinda going through this story. I wanna talk about the myth of the solo developer in a little bit, but, like, you would never guess that this was a solo project or even just, like, a two-person project. Just looking at these screens of Chasing Static and knowing that he was mostly working with node-based visual scripting for even Hollow Body is shocking to me as a developer.
Honestly, for me as well, and that was one of the things that, like, kind of getting into his devlogs and really him talking about, like, the process and the learning and kind of the trial and error, but using multiple tools because Adventure Game Studios, he was using that in conjunction with Unity to be able to help, like, set up inventory systems and, branching storyline stuff. But when dealing with that kind of programming, he was talking about how when he had bugs, there were layers to dig through because, you're doing system on top of system on top of system, and then when something breaks, then you have to backtrack in such a way that it almost becomes no, not almost. It is a tedious journey to backtrack to fix.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the challenges again is that you don't really get that level of control with visual scripting. And then when you run into things like, say, optimization or how good is it going to run on a particular system, if you are like targeting console ports, and as far as I know, Hollowbody right now is just a Steam release, but that's going to make things difficult in the future if porting to consoles is a goal. I'm not sure that it is. But those are just, yeah, like what you're saying, being able to chase down bugs and kind of knowing what the problems are. Yeah, visual scripting is going to be a
You
challenge
mentioned
for
something,
sure.
and now I actually have a question for you, Adrian.
Sure.
We haven't talked about really like PC specs and stuff like that ever, but for me, I
Hmm.
am a team red. Like I am AMD all day, all the way. But I will say when I was playing this game, my computer sounded like a jet engine.
My computer, I'm on a laptop, so my computer always sounds like a jet engine. It's a beefy one, but it always sounds like a jet engine if I'm doing anything beyond just like
Okay,
internet
gotcha. So
browsing.
you didn't notice like yours being any particularly louder then, right?
Well, I played the game on my Steam Deck attached to my
Oh.
TV. So I actually haven't tried it on my computer. I will say it ran perfectly well on Steam Deck. It played it like a console game. So I didn't really notice any like frame rate drops or anything like that. So and again, it was docked to my television, and my TV is a decent ways away from the Steam Deck. So if it was like generating any extra noise or anything that the Steam Deck normally does, I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Okay, I wasn't sure, but every time that I turn this game on, and I game on my PC all the time, this game was not it did not do good things for my computer, like, it was so loud. So when you brought up optimization, I was just like, "Yeah, it definitely, it needs some."
I had already said the phrase, the myth of the solo developer. A lot of games that get credit for being a solo project, and usually the games that people talk about, especially those who are interested in going into game development and being one of these kind of well-known, probably doing pretty well for themselves developers, they think of things like Undertale, they think of things like Stardew Valley that famously have solo developers, except those games weren't solo developed. Undertale had a series of artists that worked on that game, and a little bit. I believe that one had a little bit of coding support, though most of it was Toby Fox. Stardew Valley had a number of support as well. Um, this game actually is, as far as I can tell, and as far as like what is shown on the Moby Games credits and the credits in the actual game, pretty much a solo
Ye
dev. Like you have the voice actors, you have one person helping with the PR. Um, and I'm even like looking. I actually have to pull the game up on my Steam store page just to double check this, so because I don't want to speak out of turn. I don't want to be that kind of podcast person. Um, but I'm pretty sure. But I'm pretty sure, yeah, like they published the game themselves, so they don't even have a publisher for this. So this like really is a pretty straightforward single dev thing. And yeah, it's not their first game, but like for someone who also says that they're not much of a programmer, that they're primarily an artist, I mean, when we talk about this game being like a PS2 throwback, I mean, the game looks like a PlayStation 2 game. I mean, most like retro throwback games that are being released right now are shooting for PlayStation 1 level graphics, not even PlayStation 2. Like, you know, we sometimes as gamers like to kind of pigeonhole anything that is sort of low poly into, oh, that looks like a PS2 game, and usually it's like 3 times, 4 times better than the PS2 game. I remember I heard that a lot about Deadly Premonition when Deadly Premonition came out on the Xbox 360, that game looks like a Dreamcast game, and it's like, no, you just do not remember what Dreamcast games actually looked like. I mean, obviously Deadly Premonition didn't look like a top tier Xbox 360 game, but it was still like well above that previous generation. In this case, we have a game that really looks like it could have been on the PlayStation 2. Like, and not just like a low budget PS2 game either. Like, this looks like a fairly well budgeted PlayStation 2 game. And it's one
And
person.
truly, like, and I for anyone that has not seen anything for Hollowbody, I wanna say, like, it's impressive. Just, like, the look of it. And honestly, not just the look, the entire vibe of this game feels like it is a PS2 game. Like, he he managed to capture the look and feel of that.
Yeah, I mean, like, we'll get into the game itself and how it feels to play and all of that in just a minute. But I do want to say that, like, you look at this game, you would not imagine that this was a single developer. Like, absolutely not. I mean, again, I just got done saying that Undertale is not actually a solo developed game, nor Stardew Valley, but like this one actually can make that claim, and that is very surprising. And like, it's not a very long game either, but it is also about the length of what PlayStation 2 games used to be. It's about the length of what video games used to be. I would argue personally, we don't have to go into to this too much. It's a little bit of a tangent, but games are way too long now. My Hollowbody playthrough, and I only did one of the 3 available endings in the game, but I have 5.5 hours is what's listed. I mean, that's about how long it took me to play most games on the PlayStation 2.
You know, I think mine was a little bit longer, and part of that was because, like, there were times where I would pause it and go upstairs and then, like, make dinner and then forget about it. Mine may have been, like, 9 hours at the most, and I'm not sure how many of our listeners, like, remember those days, but when you think of, like, Resident Evil 2, you know, if you could beat that game in I forget how many hours, X amount of hours with just the knife, you got alternate costumes.
Right, those games were designed to be speedrun a lot of the time, and, like, that was their incentive to have you replay the game was, can you replay it in a certain amount of time? And usually there was some kind of reward associated with that, and that's how they got replay out of these games that, again, were fairly short. And so, this is a game that, like, if I had paid $50 on the PlayStation 2 when it was brand new, this is exactly the experience that I would have expected. And those games usually had development teams of like, 10, 15, maybe 20 or 30 on the higher end back then. To see that being done by one person, even in 2024, again, like games are not made by one person typically. And usually when you hear that they are, it's usually not the case. Um, but in this case it is, and, like, that is particularly surprising considering, just how polished this game, looks and feels for the most part. Hollow Body is kinda unique in a couple of ways. Like, we've kinda mentioned that it's clearly taking some cues from PlayStation 2 era of horror games, which includes stuff like Silent Hill. I definitely kind of feel a little bit of a Siren vibe in some places, though maybe that's just because everybody in the American localization of Siren, or the English localization of Siren, I should say, have English accents, and this is a game that actually takes place in the UK, which is rare
Yes, but
for this
also
kind of game.
where Nathan is from.
That makes the most sense, right? To try and, like, use the area that you know, and I think actually one of the interviews that we'll post in the show notes, like, specifically noted that it was like, well, a lot of horror games tend to be set in the US, but that's not a culture I really know a lot about. I should probably do something that, like, is in my backyard, which is interesting to me just because, like, I kind of got a very unreal feel from the setting. I'm not from the UK, and I don't know what a lot of the UK looks like, but, this game is also set in a near future sci-fi dystopia. It's not like Signalis, which is set like thousands of years into the future. This is like a near future sort of alternate universe that takes place in a particular part of the UK. And like to me playing the game, it just felt like a completely like fictional city. It felt like a sci-fi dystopia horror. It did not feel like a place that would have existed in reality, even if the place wasn't dilapidated. But apparently it does, and I think that that kind of feeling, reverberates for me as an American because I am not used to the location that Nathan Bramley specifically focused the game on, this part of the UK. But I think that it kind of behooves us to talk a little bit before we kind of dive into those specifics about how the game starts, because I think the game actually starts with a very different kind of feeling on that beach with the overcast skies, almost kind of reminding me of like an A24 film or what like the PlayStation 2 equivalent of an A24 film would be.
Oh, yeah. No, I didn't think about that before, but you're absolutely right.
And I don't know like how long it was in development, but this game kind of starts in the shadow of a sort of pandemic where we have researchers on this beach looking into events. You're never I don't think they really go into too much detail about the things that they're trying to study, at least for this introduction. All the characters, including the character that you play very briefly, spoilers, in like hazmat suits on this beach talking to each other like, "Oh, we're really not supposed to be here." And, like, even that moment of the game at the very beginning felt so unique. Like, you're playing a game that is a survival horror. You do get multiple options about what camera type that you wanna use and how the controls work, and that's stuff that I wanna get into a little bit later, but, like, regardless of what you choose, this, like, opening segment of just walking on the beach, talking about this incident that you're not quite sure about, there's really no music, you're just walking in one direction, talking about how you're really not supposed to be here. You're just going to get in, get out. It really started to remind me of movies like, definitely a different look and feel, but it kind of reminded me a little bit of Annihilation a little bit.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah, this crew who's on a job, you're not quite 100% sure what's going on as they're working towards it. Everything just feels generally unsettling.
That's very good setup because it gives you some world history. You start the game as Sasha, and I think it's interesting because they're talking about, like and something happening, some bio something happening, and you learn a kind of a little bit of the history of Sasha's family, and, like, that little bit of setup, and, like, she joined whatever this hazmat team is to get answers, to learn more about, like, her background and her family. And I really thought that was a I thought that was a great way to give you that exposition.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very effective opening that doesn't have a lot of gameplay, but still feels like the kind of intro that you could only get in a video game. It really does kind of like bring you into the world and bring you into the vibe of the game fairly slowly in this intro before, you are told to go off the beaten path and you go into this cave, and it's really like this cave where the game starts to kind of like show its inspiration. Like I was saying, I think this game, despite being, in the same wheelhouse as something like a Silent Hill, does a lot to establish its own identity. You go into this cave, and then like suddenly they're kind of like trying to match the camera angles that the original Silent Hill does, the one that we talked about, like when you go into the alleyway. It does this like top down thing, and the camera gets all shaky as you're going through. Like the intro of Sasha going through this cave to kind of like try and see where this disturbance, this signal that that she's seeing is um very much like matching the the camera angles of that part of Silent Hill. So this is like the first moment I think that we start to kind of get that like kind of like, oh, okay, this is the kind of game that it is.
Oh, yeah.
At the same time, also, I noted that that is also when the color grading starts to become very red. So you start to like, as the music and sound effects start to like kick in and start to get that feeling of dread pumping. Everything starts to become this like very red and black palette. Lamont, I don't know if you have ever seen um like the movie As Above, So
I
Below.
haven't.
It's pretty good. I mean, saw it a while back, like, not too long ago. It's a movie from 2014. Um, but there was a period in time, actually, that it wasn't just this movie. There were a couple of movies that were about going down into caves, and the further they go down into caves, the more, like, weird eldritch horror stuff starts to
Oh my
happen.
god, yes, that was I oh my god. I'm glad that you mentioned that. I'm trying to think of the movie.
Mhm.
Um, it's gonna bother me. I can't think of that movie at the moment, but yes, I remember that time, and there were several movies that pulled that off.
But yeah, the one that this one was really calling back to me film-wise was As Above, So Below. Like, I'm looking at the poster right now that is very stark red, very stark black, which is essentially what the color grading starts to do in this segment before Sasha gets to a ledge where you hear this deep voice. Suddenly it goes first person. You are no longer controlling Sasha. You are from the perspective of something else that rushes towards her before everything goes black, and we get the actual plot of the game, which is our main character, Mika, who sort of recaps what's been going on and talks a little bit more about the actual story of the game. That there is this pandemic, there is this virus. You play characters who are. You're gonna have to take a lead. I don't remember what they do.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Their job.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat that? I had to like take a moment. Um, my dad just sent me a message who doesn't like message me ever, so I just needed to double check something for a moment.
That's wild.
Yeah, I know. It
I
was,
mean, that's a good reason.
yeah, it was really weird. I'm like, what is going on? It's my
Oh,
dad.
I was just this is like, I don't remember the plot details of this game. It's gonna be the biggest problem of talking about, like, what this game is
Okay,
actually
not a
about.
problem because I actually do remember a lot of the plot of this game.
Yeah, so all we've said is that, like, you get to the ledge, Sasha gets pushed off, cuts to Mika talking about the actual story.
Basically, like, there's some bio nonsense happening, and they're survivors of it. And I mentioned before, like, her family survived it, but she goes into a cave and some stuff goes down. Because she's trying to find one of her coworkers, one of the other people in the hazmat suit. His name is Max, and Max is basically gone missing. So when you have to go find Max. When you go to find Max, you go into a cave. Some stuff goes down, and then suddenly you go from Sasha to her sister, Mika. There are kind of three characters that you really get to know. It is Sasha, is Mika, and is Tex.
And I will say you barely get to know
Yeah,
Tax.
and I was gonna say, yeah, you barely know Tax. Tax is a um kind of in the beginning, he's like your buddy, and he's like, hey, yeah, we're gonna make this happen, and then he disappears for a long time, and then he shows up at the end of the game. There are in betweens where he's on the radio, but it's
Mhm.
barely a thing. And Mika is like, hey, I need to look for my sister. She was in like the evacuation zone. I just remembered that was what it was. So we have Mika in her flying car heading to the evacuation zone, and suddenly the car loses power.
Yeah, and it's definitely, like, implied it's because she's in this, like, specific part of the city.
So like it is
Yeah.
definitely implied that the hover car, the flying car lost power because it is in a specific part of the city, and that there are plans for Mika.
Right, and then from there, the game kind of jumps into the kind of gameplay that I think you would expect from this kind of game. You are in a car accident, a flying car accident, but still a car accident. And this is where you start to go through that like standard tutorial of like movement. Here's how you use your inventory items. Here's how you like heal and things. And in that moment is when you start to kind of like understand the kind of game that this is, which very much is, if you are familiar with any horror game of the era that this game is being evocative of, um, you have a separate inventory menu, you have items that you can use in that inventory. The health bar looks very similar to the Resident Evil health bar. And depending on what movement style you picked at the beginning of the game determines whether or not you are going to be using tank controls, whether or not you're going to be using like your standard Resident Evil 4 style, like third person controls. The game actually does give you like quite a bit of options and actually gives you more options after you beat the game. But this is sort of getting ahead of ourselves at this moment. Um, but the essential setup and like feeling and vibe of the game, despite, like, the familiarity of the controls and the camera and everything, is fairly unique. Like, the beach opening itself, where everything is actually fairly bright, you don't need a light source like a flashlight to be able to see things around you, um, still has this very dreary vibe with a steel cast sky, the kind of thing that you would not see very much on the PlayStation 1 or the PlayStation 2. In that way, almost feeling a little bit more modern, but with very PlayStation 2-esque, low poly graphics. And then here we have like a full on first person segment with the flying car, with like showing you that this is what the future looks like in 2080. I would honestly say, I referenced above, so below with the cave segment and Annihilation, which is another movie that takes place in sort of a sci-fi near future setting, but for the most part feels vaguely modern. In that flying car, flying past like the cities and such, that starts to give you more of either like a Blade Runner or an Alien feel almost. And you know merging that kind of like urban sci-fi environment with something science fiction, um that's not something I've really ever seen before, despite the familiarity of this, like, almost feeling like a PlayStation 2 game.
Oh yeah, it definitely has some good modern like modern setup and story flow. One of the things I want to talk about that like kind of thinking about this game and a lot of the opening pieces are the camera angles. And like the cinematography of it.
Yeah, I mean, some of that worked for me. This is starting to get into some of the things that I wanted to say when we started to get into the gameplay and again, like kind of the look of the game. Um, I will say that Nathan did talk about this in one of the podcast interviews that we listened to. That definitely was a fan of the kind of fixed camera angles that you would see in a lot of the games that we've covered in this podcast, right? Your Silent Hills, your Resident Evils, your Alone in the Darks, Alone in the Dark really being kind of the forebearer of that kind of style. And I know Nathan has said in the interview himself that that was definitely something that he was shooting for, but had a lot of difficulty actually making it work. um I would describe it personally as a good effort, but Lamont, I don't know how you feel.
So no, I don't think it was perfect. I want to say that out the gate. I do not think that it was a perfect replication or like, but I will say that I can see what he was aiming for. And in some areas, it was done very well. In other areas, not so much.
Yeah, and at this point, I want to pause. I have a little bit of a rant, maybe, but I think it is an important one to say because both you and me, Lamont, we're both coming from the perspective of people who have made video games before. We've worked on games. We are game developers ourselves, like Nathan. We are also doing a podcast that looks at games partially from the developer perspective, but we're also giving our feelings, our opinions on things. And I felt, navigated that fairly gracefully with a lot of the games that we've covered in the past, which have all been old video games, games where, and not just old video games, but games that were in what was at the time their AAA space. So these are games that had budgets, they had publisher support behind them, and just came out at a very different time in a very different context than what this game is coming out in 2024. I think it is important to say up front that we want to make an entertaining podcast. We want to talk a little bit about the history, and we want to talk about the things that we like, but we also want to be honest with our feelings. We want to be honest about our opinions on things. And this definitely starts to get into touchy territory when we're talking about a game that came out this year with a much smaller budget, with, again, a rarity, but also a solo developer. And, this game has done fairly good for itself. I'm looking on Steam right now, and I can tell you that this game got somewhere in the vicinity of like over 1,000. I think it's actually close to like 2,000 reviews on Steam right now, sitting at very positive with, okay, it's 1,100 reviews, so not quite 2,000. It's like a little over 1,000 reviews, but that's like the number that you really need to hit, especially if you've been able to maintain very positive for that to be seen as favorable on the Steam algorithm. So it's doing fairly well for itself, and it's got like over 1,000 reviews and everything like that. But it's still like a smaller game. Like 1,000 reviews is not 5,000 reviews, not 10,000 reviews like certain other indie games will get. It is well within that space, and it is a small enough game that there is a very real chance that Nathan Hamley might actually listen to this podcast, as small as this podcast is.
Oh my god, I didn't even consider that.
No, it is something to absolutely consider. So I think it is important to state outright, especially from my perspective, because yes, I am a game developer, but also I went to school for journalism. I went to school for communications and criticism. That's a degree I have. And I do approach these things from an analytical perspective. And a wonderful critic who I follow on the internet by the name of Gita Jackson actually made a post on Blue Sky fairly recently that spoke to me, that was that like the best criticism really does come from people who've actually tried to make a thing, like from the people who have actually like put themselves in the role of a creator. And this is a long way of me saying that like I know what it takes to make a video game. I know how hard and how difficult it is. And I think that in any respect, that Hollowbody is a triumph, especially for a solo developer, to make something that looks as good as it does. I mean, again, this feels like if this game had come out in, let's say 2002, like you would believe that this game had a at least a 10-15 member team on it. You would believe that this game costs somewhere in the vicinity of like 2, 3, maybe even $5 million to create. You would absolutely believe that in 2002. And for a solo developer to accomplish that in 2024 is astounding. It's almost a miracle, honestly. So when I talk about this game, and when I give my feelings and opinions on it, I want to be clear that all of that is coming from the perspective of I know how difficult it is to make a game. And I know how almost impossible it is to be a solo developer on a game. And I think that is all very important context when I say that there are certain things about this game that just did not work for me. And that is not to say that I dislike this game. Actually, I like this game quite a bit. As we kind of like dive a little bit deeper into the play mechanics, as we dive a little bit deeper into the level design, and now that we are kind of like wading into like one of my sticking points, really, which is the attempts to try and match the inspiration, to match the feeling and the vibe of something like a Silent Hill or a Resident Evil that very effectively did the fixed camera angles And I think it's important to note that that is actually an option in this game. It's not even something that you have to have. And I almost wonder, really, if the fact that, like, there was an option to have a camera that was more of a traditional third person follows you camera, which I would say is the way to play this game. I tried to play this game with tank controls, with fixed camera angles, and I played through most of it before I finally was like, "Oh, let me switch to the other camera angles and see how it plays," and was like, "Oh no, this is 1,000 times better."
So I want to interrupt and say that um being able to switch that camera angle piece, that was recent. That was an update. It didn't start that way.
Well, and I was, like, looking at some of the DLC updates and seeing that the third person camera now available and everything, and, like, because one of the things that I was thinking when I was playing the game initially was that, like, I wonder how much of the issue was the fact that the game had the option to do it and wasn't just built around third person camera and tank controls from the beginning. And even looking at this, like, third person camera update, it doesn't even look like it looks like only the camera system was updated and that it did have the option of the different control styles even before this. And I do wonder how much of that played an issue. Because you and me, we've talked on this podcast about tank controls and fixed camera angles before. Both you and me have said we don't mind tank
Oh yeah,
controls.
not at all.
But it is very important that the game designs its game around tank controls. And
Absolutely.
Hollowbody absolutely struggled with that. This was something I noted in my review of Alone in the Dark 2024, which was only available on our Patreon. We don't have enough Patreon people. We don't have enough listeners yet to justify that. I probably should put that review on YouTube at some point. But what I was going to say is that there's a moment in the Alone in the Dark 2024 game. It's one moment in the entire game that switches to fixed camera angles. And it is terrible. It
Oof.
is awful. And the reason why is because, you know, Resident Evil and Silent Hill were both very good about when the camera changes angles, like whatever direction you're holding is considered forward. And you will continue to move in that direction until you let go and stop moving, and then the controls reset to whichever direction feels the most normal, quote unquote, to go forward. Like they really build those controls and really think about the orientation of which way you are moving when you switch from one camera to another. And Nathan even noted on the interview that we're going to link to that that was something that they struggled with.
Which makes sense considering that Nathan is not a programmer.
No, it absolutely makes sense. So I thought a word that you used earlier, Lamont, was interesting. How you said replicate. They didn't replicate those camera angles very well. And I do, when we have talked in the past about the fixed camera angles that you would see in games like this, we noted that a lot of it really was came down to those developers using the inspiration of films that they had seen to work those angles out in a way that made sense,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
And I wonder, and I wonder this about a lot about Hollow Body, and we'll get into the gameplay in just a little bit, but I do wonder how much this game honestly was hindered by looking at the games that it was trying to replicate maybe a little too closely.
Oh, I didn't think about that, but I see that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that when thinking about this from the fixed camera angles, again, like, the Alone in the Dark team, the Resident Evil team, the Silent Hill team were all looking at things like Dario Argento. They were looking at things like the films of David Lynch, and we're like, okay, how do we make that work in a video game setting? We do not have the luxury of a dynamic camera that can follow the player, so we're going to try and match the feeling of film, but in a way that like works with the game itself. Whereas Hollow Body does not have the same limitations as those games have done, but is still trying to like take inspiration directly from those games themselves and being less effective at it as a result. And I really, really do wonder how much that does hinder this game.
It's something I did not think about until, you're bringing this up, but no, I see what you're getting at.
I mean, again, I will say to this game's credit, The setting is very unique, the vibe is very unique, the writing is very unique. When it actually comes down to the brass tacks gameplay, everything feels slightly familiar, but also slightly worse. And I don't know that that's a problem necessarily, because again, it was a solo developer. It was a game with a much smaller budget. And, if this game had come out, like, in the way that it plays and the way that it looks in 2002, let's say, I would put it in the same category as something like, no, a lot of games that we haven't covered yet, but like games like Rule of Rose, let's say, where clearly this game is another developer's take on this style of gameplay that isn't as effective, but it does bring its own thing to the table. So, none of this is to say that this game is bad and that people shouldn't play it. Absolutely not. Like, I think again, like especially compared to some other games, I think this game actually has a more unique voice. And believe me, if you think I'm making people angry now, wait till we cover Signalis. Um, but this isn't just about the camera angles. This is a game in the Silent Hill mold where you have an outdoor segment where it's a little bit more open world, and then you have the more claustrophobic indoor moments that are kind of like your Zelda dungeons. A comparison that I made when we did the Silent Hill episode a couple months back. And the first one is an apartment building, and it's really hard to not think of the apartments from Silent Hill 2 when you're in this apartment building. Suddenly, the uniqueness of the setting sort of goes away. Obviously, there are like documents that you read, and this game has a very unique findable, which is the using the radio to catch like ghosts, quote unquote. Let's
I
say,
did like that a lot, honestly.
yeah. No, I love that too. These little side stories that you get to hear that like bring you into the world a bit more. Probably one of my favorite aspects of the game, honestly, was those collectibles. But like if you're just like considering it from the gameplay, finding items and trying to figure out what key you need to get through this area and such, it's really hard not to think of the apartments from Silent Hill 2. The setting, the thing that makes Hollowbody unique, that sort of sci-fi setting sort of kind of goes away once you come into this building. And the first part of it's pretty good. Like there are parts of this game where everything is gelling and it's like, "Oh, I like these puzzles." The ammo is limited, but it's not so limited that I felt like out of my element most of the time. I felt like I had a good handle on the combat, which is again very similar to the combat from Silent Hill. But then you'll have like moments like the second half of the apartments where you get locked into this one space, but the puzzles are suddenly they're not that interesting. Suddenly you have this like one part where it's like, "Oh, I'm in this one hallway. All the doors are locked. There doesn't seem to be a way forward."
Oh, fire
But
puzzle.
like if you remember this part, Lamont, like this just followed a puzzle where you were like hunting around a house looking for the passcode to something, and you had to use all of these context clues to figure out the password.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and that was actually a lot of fun. Like, it wasn't like something like, "Oh, you just find the sticky note that tells you the password." Like, no, you really have to like, "Oh, it's supposed to be this specific date, and I have to like compare this one document to this thing on the calendar." You really had to like think
You
through that
did. That
puzzle
was a
and
good
do a
one.
lot of deduction. That was one of my favorite puzzles in the entire game, and it's sad that it's like like one of the first ones because that is almost immediately followed by this puzzle that is just there is one open door that has some alcohol in it, and then like right outside that door are a bunch of locked rooms, a note on a wall that says, "Oh, when the fire alarm goes off, all the doors will unlock in the building." And there's just a barrel there that you can put the alcohol and then light with the lighter that you got, and that's it. That's the entire
Yep.
puzzle. It's like it's not even like you have to like find a couple of items around a place. It's just like no, you find this like one thing in one room that's right next to the part that you have to use it
Also,
in.
I'm pretty positive you had the lighter the entire time.
Yeah, right. The lighter is something you just start with. And it's just it was so wild to me that it was like, wow, we just had like a couple of like you had to like hunt around the apartment for a while, Then you had to like this like really, really good puzzle where you had to use deduction and you really had to think about the space and you had to really think about like what was going on. Immediately followed by this thing that just feels like time filler. That just feels like, well, why didn't I just like go out the door and then like go through a hallway and then another hallway? Like, why did I have to like stop and do
Yeah,
this?
you know what? It's so funny that you bring that up too, because like I remember thinking the same. Because that
Hmm.
first real puzzle, like you had to think about it. Because like you had the safe, you had to look at the pictures, you had to figure out like, okay, well, like you had two sets of pictures because you had a birthday picture and a graduation picture. So then at that point you had to like there was some like math that you had to do some deduction there. Then you had another document in the kitchen that like talked about like the date of birth of the child and like all of these little pieces and like it was a very like detailed math puzzle. But it was doable. It wasn't terribly hard, but you had to think. And that was the only puzzle where you really had to like think and like put pieces together.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I mean, I'm not going to say that the entire rest of the game was like that, using the alcohol on the barrel puzzle, where it just felt like this like really quick bit of time filler. There are other decent puzzles in the game, but they never reach the heights of that earlier part of the apartment. Yeah, I couldn't help but think that this just feels like a weaker version of Silent Hill 2 outside of that one apartment.
Yep.
That one apartment was just such a highlight, and it was just like, "Oh, man, if the rest of the game had puzzles like that, it would have been really good." And, I feel vaguely the same about the combat in the game. I felt vaguely the same about running around the town. I will say, like, darkness is something that this game and Silent Hill both use, but is also a thing that frustrates me a lot. Silent Hill, I think, does a really good job of, like, going between, like, the dark segments where you have to run through it versus, like, the kinda segments where the town is, like, foggy, but still you can see what you're doing. We played Silent Hill 1 a couple months ago, and, there's only really one moment in that game where everything goes dark in the city portion, and it is meant to be frustrating. It is meant to be sort of panic fulfilling. And, for the most part, you're just meant to run away and get to the next key point. Same thing happens in Silent Hill 2, after you leave the hospital, where then suddenly the dark side of Silent Hill takes over the town itself. And for the most part, you're just like running from point A to point B. There's not a lot of puzzle solving having to do, right? The outdoor segments of this game were the worst for me. I don't know if that was the same for your experience, but like especially after I left that apartment. That was probably the hardest part of the game for me. Leaving the apartment and then having to like go through that park
Oh yeah.
in the game where you have to like go like between a couple of points to be able to find the code to get to the next part of the city. I died so many times there in that part of the game.
I'm gonna ask you a question.
Yeah.
What weapon were you using?
I think at that point I had started using the guitar that you get.
I'm glad that you brought that up. That is the best weapon in the game.
But I also am trying to remember at what point do you get the sign, like the street sign that doubles as an axe.
Um, so do you remember the fountain?
Refresh my memory. Where is the fountain in the
Okay,
game?
so the fountain is after the apartments, you're in the
Mhm.
city. After the city, you have to go into the apartment building and set it on fire. After you set the apartment building on fire, then you go to the park. The park is, or I'm sorry, the park of the fountain is where you get the axe. That's also nearby where there's the dead body with the heart locket.
Gotcha. Okay. You said the guitar was the best one in the game. See, I didn't know if that was the case, and that was one of my problems was that you get several melee weapons outside of the guns, but I really never had a sense of like which of these is better than the other.
So it might be wrong. For me, that guitar was the best weapon in the game. Now, I will also tell you I did not get the flamethrower.
I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I knew that there was a
There
flamethrower
is,
in the
in fact,
game.
a flamethrower in the game, and I hear that is the best weapon in the game. There's also a giant knife that looks like Pyramid Head's, like, knife.
I did know about the Pyramid Head knife that actually has a name that I think references that it's supposed to be a pair of scissors. I knew about that, but I didn't get that because I think that's an unlockable, and I only played through the game once. Yeah, I mean, I never really had a good intuition on, like, what weapon I was supposed to use on one thing. The other thing too is I definitely felt that there was, like, an imbalance in resources. Like, the reason part of the reason I had such a hard time with that park segment isn't just because I couldn't see anything, which is why I don't like those, like, unlit segments in almost any video game I play, including horror games, but also because I did not have any ammo. I didn't have any health, and I didn't have any health items to be able to cure myself. And what's funny is that directly after that segment with the park, suddenly I found all kinds of health items and all kinds of ammo, and I was never low on resources. But it was just that like that one part of the game where suddenly I didn't feel like I had anything. And I was like mostly just trying to run away from dogs before they would kill me in one
Oh,
hit.
yeah, those dogs were super annoying. But it's interesting, like, kinda talking to you about your gameplay experience because I felt like I had a lot of ammo, and all I was doing is, melee attacking.
No, I definitely stuck to guns. When I had the ammo to do it, which again, by this time you get towards the end of the game, and again, it's not a very long game, ammo was plenty, health was plenty. I didn't actually feel, and also you can run from most of the enemies and not really have to worry about combat a lot in the earlier parts of the game. That it wasn't really that much of a problem for me. So, there was, like, kind of a difficulty imbalance, I felt, where, the end of the game where you would expect things to be a lot more harrowing, and certainly in terms of the story and certain, set pieces and things that happen a little bit later on, which were all excellent, I must say. In terms of the actual gameplay, in terms of the actual, like, Resident Evil style of game, I really felt like that the all the difficulty was front loaded there at the beginning of the game.
I can see that for sure. Yeah, I feel like by the time that I was, I guess in the subway area, like, nothing felt very threatening.
Oh, yeah, the subway area you're talking like, that's basically the end of the game.
Yeah.
By the time I got to the subway segment of the game, like, again, overloaded on ammo, overloaded on healing items. I got a little lost during that period of time trying to figure out, like, what was the next thing I had to do. And I was, again, really down to the camera in a lot of places. Like, there was a section of that subway where the way that the fixed camera angles worked, I couldn't tell that, there was a hallway
Oh, yes.
that I could go down, and that was the hallway I had to go to continue the game. I think it's important to note, like, the big catalyst moment, which is a conversation you have with, like, the one NPC that Mika meets, at the end of the apartments. There is a person, the one survivor, it seems, in the entire city, which in and of itself is very suspect, right?
Right?
Who you have this conversation with, and depending on the choices that you make and how the conversation goes, that person may either jump or they may follow you for the rest of the game, which seems very, very similar to one of the branching paths inside of Life is Strange, but that's neither here nor there. So that's one of the interesting things. So when I played the game, I was able to actually have the person survive and follow me around for the rest of the game, which then gets you one of the endings into the game. Lamont, that was not the case for you.
Nope.
The guy totally
Oh, he
jumped.
absolutely jumped. I wasn't even sure too because, like, I was going through, I was answering the questions. I'm not gonna pretend that I wasn't a little distracted.
Well, I will say, like, Lamont, because you didn't really get to experience the guy following you around.
Yeah, and so I'm sorry, but
Not
yeah.
really much comes of it, frankly. Like, he comments on things occasionally. You never learn his name. And I spent most of the game thinking this guy was totally not real. I really thought this guy was a figment of your imagination. By the time you get to the end of the game, like, if there's one thing that is clear is that, no, this was a real person the whole time. Which again, just kinda, like, goes back to that feeling I had that from the conversations I was having with the person on the phone and everything that just led to that confusion of oh, like, is anything that I'm hearing even supposed to be real?
Oh, wait, so that's a good question. Now that you said that, like, so I didn't save him. I got distracted. They were asking me questions, and I thought I was answering right, but eventually he jumped. You know what? I think I remember the real key part that changed my run is that while you're talking to him, the other character, Tax, is calling you on the radio,
Mhm. Right.
and I answered the radio.
Right, I really think that is probably the big dividing line between whether he jumps or whether he knots from the branches, as I remember it, is that if you choose to answer the radio and you don't pay attention, you kinda disregard him, that's gonna cause him to jump for sure.
Yeah. And so, yeah, at some point, because I was talking to him, and then I was like, "Oh no, I need to answer the radio." And I answered the
Mhm.
radio, and he jumped.
Well, I don't think you missed much, and honestly, I think you got the better ending because we both watched the other ending on YouTube. At least you got the more interesting ending, I would
I agree
say.
with that.
Because again, like, by the time I get to the ending just tries to treat everything like it's straightforward, and I was like, "Wait, so that guy was real the whole time? What was all that stuff that the person on the other end of the phone was even talking about?" Like, what guilt does Mika have? Like, clearly, the by the time you get to the end, spoilers, our eldritch tree thing is clearly the one influencing you and trying to get you to go to the end, to make mistakes, to make bad decisions, in order to achieve something. I'm guessing just, taking over the world, as viruses want to do. All of that said, though, I do at the very least appreciate the game trying some things, and I appreciate the fact that it has alternate endings at all. I did a rant for the IGDA organization that I volunteer for, where we run an event called "Teach Me Something in 5 Minutes." I did a little 5 minute thing on like the need for shorter games, and one of the things that I felt like games of the PlayStation 2 and prior era did very well was having shorter games that had a lot of content despite being shorter. One of the ways that you saw this manifest was multiple endings, ways that you could play the game differently. And I really appreciated the attempt here. I was a little disappointed to see that like whether the guy jumps or not is the only branching path. You do have a conversation with choices at the end of the game that don't seem to make a difference. It really seems like the only thing that really determines your ending is whether this guy jumps or not.
There are certainly different areas in the game where, like, these choices could have mattered, because I can tell you right now that there was a key in the floorboards that I never got.
Oh, right, yeah. I remember that. I didn't get that key either.
And, like, if you went with, like, okay, if you don't get the key, then you don't obtain this, and by not obtaining this comfort item or whatever it is, the guy on the building is going to jump. And that, because he jumped, then this character will then become affected. There were these little key points that, like, if he expanded on these, it would have made that difference, that and those endings more impactful, I think.
Well, and even beyond that for me, I just never really understood what the point of this character was or how my decision to save him directly leads to that other ending.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Like, I never really felt a connection there. I did not understand what it was supposed to mean thematically. Like, I didn't really ever, like, get this, like, really, like, good connection. Again, I was really happy to see a second ending option, and then, there's a hidden joke option that I also didn't do, but I watched on YouTube and was very appreciative that it was there, because it's the kind of thing that I feel like games have lost in the past, and I'm glad that an attempt was made. But that is just one part of the game. There are still things that I appreciate. Like moving a little bit further into the plot line, I do want to call out one particular moment, the for lack of a better term, I guess, like cave diving horror like you're as above, so below. The moment that you go into the sewers. Normally, I wouldn't praise a sewer segment in the game, but this is one of the best sewer segments I think I've ever seen. And a very good example, actually, of Hollowbody understanding its influence, but doing it in its own unique way that felt satisfying and actually horrific. It's probably the scariest moment of the game. Suddenly, you have to, in order to move forward, for some reason inside of the sewer, there just happens to be a lot of weird stuff that shouldn't be there. And by weird stuff, I mean people's hearts, some
Yeah.
of which are beating on their own, and one of which that is not.
Yeah. Yep. I loved that puzzle, but also, like, that was one of the only times in the game where I was like, "Oh, like, we're playing a mind game."
And it's like, it's not even really a puzzle, is the funny thing. It is mostly just like, find these 4 things and put them in this, like, and take them back to this one location. So there are, you go into the subway and then you have to, which is already like this confusing labyrinth that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And there's no map for the area. You just kind of have to memorize where everything is and try to like kind of feel your way back to where there are these hands that are just like embedded into the walls holding their arms out, and you take the hearts that you've been finding and you place them inside the palm. And once you place them inside the palm, they stop beating. If you have the follower character, that's the other thing. Again, going back to like what is in your mind, what isn't in your mind. The guy you're following with makes no reaction whatsoever to anything that's happening in the game. Sometimes that's to the game's detriment. Here it works very well. And even your character will, like, make comments when you're describing it. Like, Lamont, did you ever go into the inventory and, like, look at the hearts?
I don't remember doing that.
Like, for all of them, she'll say something like, "I don't remember picking this
Oh
up."
my god, what? I did what?
Like, "I don't know why I have this."
That's insane. I did not do that.
It's so funny, but also very horrific. And then once you do get all 4 in the area, and then you start to, like, "Okay, I need to get back to the part
Oh.
that unlock," like any other survival horror, like, it's like, "Okay, I have this door that is locked. I probably need to do something to unlock it. I find these 4 hearts. I find a place where these 4 hearts go, but it doesn't actually give you anything." And it's like, okay, well, let me go back and see if that place unlocked. And then suddenly everything is scrambled. You start to try and go back the way that you came. Again, everything kind of, this is a PS2 throwback. It looks nice. It looks nicer than a PlayStation 1 game, but it's all very samey looking textures. It's all very samey looking
Mhm.
environments. And you start to like go through these caves and none of it is how you remember it.
And it changes.
Right. You spent this entire time memorizing where to go so that you could find, like, looking around, try to find a heart, remember how you got to that segment to be able to go back to go to the hands to drop it off. You have spent a lot of time trying to think your way through this space, trying to memorize it in your head. And it's small enough that it's possible to do it. Does not feel like you have to break out graph paper or anything. So you take all of this time to figure it out, and then suddenly the map completely changes on you. And now none of it makes
Yep.
sense. And you're just like turning corners, trying to get your grasp back onto where you go, and it won't work.
And, like, for me, I watched it reset once. Like, I'm not sure if I was supposed to see it, but, like, I turned around, I did something at just the right time, and I watched the reset happen.
Yeah, I don't think I actually did that myself. I think I was just always, like, moving forward with it. I kinda started to figure out what was going on, and I was like, "Oh, this is brilliant," but I never thought to turn around. So, it doesn't surprise me that there is probably, like, a way to break it because, again, it's a one-person game. There's only so much that this person can be expected to do, but it is by far the most effective horror in the entire game. Just a brilliant segment all around. Typically, when we're talking about a game that's a little bit older, you and me will talk about, the critical reception. What did people think of at the time? Obviously, with this game has only been out for a few months and such. Now, I'm old. And by that I mean I'm, I am 40, going to be moving into 41 in the summer. I am not very up on what influencers think or what the internet on YouTube or Twitch or things like that. I very much stick to my, bog standard website resources and read reviews the way that we did in 2010 and prior. And from what I have seen, it seems like this game has gotten a lot of pretty good reviews. A lot of sixes and sevens with the occasional like excellent, 8 to 9. But for the most part, it seems like this game fairly kind of falling into that pretty good could be better space. And I don't know, that feels right to me. But I also don't know that that's a bad thing because honestly a lot of the games that we've talked about on this podcast and we'll definitely talk about in the future. In fact, I got a few that are coming up. Some of my favorite games are 6 to 7 games. Games that are not amazing, not perfect, but do interesting things. And I kind of feel like Hollowbody falls into that space, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
No, I completely agree with that.
I don't know that I have a lot else to say about the game, beyond what we've kind of talked about here today. I would encourage people to absolutely check it out, especially if you are a fan of older style survival horror games. I will say this scratched the itch a little bit more than Signalis did. I haven't finished Signalis yet, and I will hold off on my full opinions on Signalis until we actually do a Signalis episode someday in the future. This scratched the itch for me a little bit more than Signalis. Not as much as Crow Country did. I think Crow Country is still, of all the classic survival horror throwbacks that have come out in recent memory, I would say that Crow Country would be my number one recommendation. Hollow Body is a very close second, however. And I do think that it matches that energy very well. I think that the setting is unique. I think that the vibes are unique. I think that the gameplay is probably the part that probably could have used a little bit more polish, or at least just something outside of the mold of your traditional Silent Hill style game to elevate it just a little bit more. But I also think that as a work of a solo developer, it is sort of a miracle that it works as well as it does at all. So this is still a very good game that is absolutely worth your time, especially if this is your genre, and especially if, say, some of the other modern horror games just didn't do it for you. I still say check Hollow Body out. It's a pretty cool game.
And I completely agree. I wanna say the same thing, like, I wasn't sure what to go in to, with Hollowbody, and I say that as someone who, like, followed the Kickstarter and watched the devlogs, but I was pleasantly surprised, and, I wanna say, Nathan Hamley, like, really outdid himself, as a solo developer who, identifies as mostly an artist, but who did the art programming and music for this game. It is worth checking it out as, just experiencing a solo developer who really put everything, who really pushed everything, who started off with something, and I'm not gonna say simple, but who started off a little more simple than he wanted to be, and then to build up to Hollow Body. I think that is truly an accomplishment.
No, 100%, 100%. This is a full-on action adventure, Silent Hill style horror game that in its day would have been the big budget AAA release that being done by a solo dev in 2024 is still an incredible accomplishment, and it's definitely a great evolution of what had come before. Someday I will play Chasing Static. I promise you, Nathan, if you're out there. Until then, I look forward to whatever it is you're going to do next. Yeah, so we need to talk about what we're doing for next month. Before we can do that, we have to talk about the elephant in the room,
Uh,
and I swear that's not an Elephant Man
it
reference.
is not. So I don't know how to start on this one. Because like,
I can do it.
well, I say it because like I am upset by it, but I know that it hit you a lot harder.
Yeah, this has been a bad couple of days for me, specifically because of this. I mean, it was a hard week just in general for me this week, but this didn't help. Let's say.
Yesterday we lost an amazing director and great person. and I think Adrian was the one who let me know, and then I let some other people know around me. But yesterday we lost David Lynch, and I don't think I would have explored so much of David Lynch's work if it wasn't for Adrian. And I don't get hurt by like celebrity stuff very often, but like right now, like I'm talking about it, and like I feel myself actually getting upset, which surprises me, but it hurt. It hurt to lose David Lynch. I think the only other celebrity that hurt me in a similar way, and as I'm right now talking about it and realizing that like I'm a little more upset about it than I realized, was when like, for me when I lost, when Jason David Frank took his own life, but this David Lynch thing like actually really like I know that it hit you, Adrian, more than it hit me. And I want you to speak to that before we talk about like what February looks like.
I will not protest to say, how much more or less, something, hits one person versus another one. I will say, from my perspective, David Lynch was not a creator that I was following very deeply in their prime, let's say. Twin Peaks aired when I was a kid, and I had a very sheltered life growing up, so I would not have been able to watch Twin Peaks when it was airing. I would not have been able to see Eraserhead, although Eraserhead was one of those works that was, like, on the periphery of pop culture so often that I heard about it just constantly and constantly, and because I grew up sheltered and because, like, the thing that wasn't as monitored as much as other media for me growing up was video games, my connection to David Lynch and his work really does come from the area of video games because his work was inspiring so many people globally, not just American video game developers, but Japanese game developers as well. And in some cases, I would say probably more Japanese developers that like, once I was in a place where I didn't have the restrictions on me that I could start to explore more art and everything. I mean, it took a while, and it really took the game Deadly Premonition that um is probably like one of those like just clearly just inspired by Lynch to almost a litigious degree, let's call it. Before I actually realized, oh, okay, so this is a take off of the show, and that I knew existed, that I knew was very popular, that I knew was from this name, who I knew had inspired some other work, but I didn't know by how much. Till I finally was like, okay, well, let me sit down and watch Twin Peaks, and yeah, no, like watching Twin Peaks was like life changing, not just in the sense of, oh, I understand all these references now. I understand that this level of influence, but just seeing something so raw and so off kilter, but in a way that like, all of David Lynch's work. We'll talk more about this next time, but all of that work exploring so many like dark reaches of the world and what humans are capable of, and yet there is this sense of hope and positivity despite the darkness. I mean, that's something that's always been something I've been a fan of. It's honestly like it's a weird point of comparison, but it's also why my favorite iteration of Batman is the animated series. My favorite versions of Batman are the light and the darkness, right?
Oh, I see that.
And
Yeah.
and David Lynch's work, once I started to explore it beyond Twin Peaks, I kind of realized that was very much its vibe, and that was the vibe of David Lynch as a human being. I think that a good example of this is that throughout the pandemic, when we were in lockdown, David Lynch was doing the weather reports, and they were silly. They again had that kind of edge to them, this like tinge of darkness behind them, but there was again this vibe of hope that things are going to be all right at the end of this like very dark tunnel, and it really felt that that was the whole point of those weather reports, to give us a little bit of levity, a little bit of humor in this like very like kind of dark time. And I don't know, that has spoken to me. It has spoken to me on the level of, don't be afraid to make things that aren't 100% clear, that are a little bit weird, and you don't need to feel like you need to explain yourself. David Lynch has always had that vibe, even, like before I saw all of the interviews and things that were basically just him saying that, or him not saying that, as it were.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, this was a creator that like really, really spoke to me, and yeah, it's been a pretty painful couple of days. Like Lamont said, as the time of recording, it's been a little over 24 hours now, maybe getting closer to 48 hours since we've known about it. And so for all of this is a long form way of saying that, coming into this Hollowbody recording, we weren't 100% sure what we were doing next
Yeah.
month. We had a couple options on the table, and we weren't 100% sold on any of them. But we know absolutely what we're doing now. And so next month, we are going to talk about David Lynch. Not necessarily his films, although they will come up. And this is a great excuse for me to go through the back catalog and watch some of the films I haven't seen in a while. But ultimately, we're going to be talking about the influence that he had on video games, and in particular, horror games.
Oh, yeah.
Or horror segments in some games that might not necessarily be considered horror games. But like I mentioned in the lead up, he has had a long-reaching influence on video games. We are not the first person to cover this topic. We will certainly be reviewing some things that other folks have said, and of course, we will give credit and we will give all those sources when we do the show notes next month. But this is really going to be from our perspective, our feelings, and a chance for us to get to also dive into a couple of games that we've wanted to dive into for a little bit, but weren't ready to like dedicate a whole episode to. We get to touch on a couple of them that I'm really excited about. It is a shame why, obviously that like dark cloud is kind of hanging over it. But that being said, this is meant to be the celebration of life. I know there is one quote that is floating out there on the internet right now where David Lynch talks about the death of Angelo Baldametti. I think I'm saying that name right. If I'm not, I apologize to Angelo. The composer that he worked with on works like Twin Peaks and other films, where he would refer to Angelo in interviews after he had passed in the present tense. And when someone pointed it out, he said, life is a continuum. It's not an ending. Like we'll see him again. So I feel like David would appreciate us talking about this as a celebration of the life, as opposed to this being an ending. So sad as I am, and as sad as I know a lot of people probably listening to this are, and other people that me and Lamont are connected to are, this is as good a time as any. Celebrate the life that they live. So we're planning on doing that next time on Playing Dread.
I look forward to it. David Lynch had a lot of influence. And I don't just mean Twin Peaks, and my god, Twin Peaks had a lot of influence.
Yep, absolutely. So looking forward to recording that. Yeah, look forward to next month on Playing Dread. We'll see you all then.
All right, cool. So once again, my name is Lamont,
And I'm Adrian.
and this was Playing Dread.
You've been listening to Playing Dread, a Q27 media production and a member of the New Jersey Horror Collective, hosted by Lamont Williams and Adrian Sandoval. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends, or just consider leaving us a review and giving us top ranks on your podcast listening service of choice. Check out our show notes at playingdread.libsym.com and consider becoming a Playing Dread patron on Patreon. Social media links including YouTube, Blue Sky, Instagram, and more can be found at www.playingdread.com. All music is under a Creative Commons Attribution license. The intro music is The Curse of the Dolls by Jeff Harvey, and other music in this episode was performed by Alex Grohl, Dimitri Taras, Grand Project, and Pump Up the Mind.